Radio, I'm Christina Onnested. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will have overall security responsibility in Gaza for an indefinite period during an interview with ABC News late Monday.
Who should govern Gaza when this is over?
Those who don't want to continue the way of Hamas. It certainly is not. I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility, because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine.
But he ruled out any general ceasefire without the release of more than 240 captives seized by Hamas in its October 7th raid into Israel. He also expressed openness to little pauses in the current fighting to facilitate the release of hostages. This comes as Israeli forces continue attacks on hospitals in Gaza, this time striking the Al-Shifa hospital and a children's hospital at the Nasser Medical Complex, which has 4 hospitals. At least 8 Palestinians were killed in the attacks, and dozens were wounded, according to Palestine's health ministry. The death toll in Gaza has surpassed 10,300. Some 40% are children. The UN Security Council failed again Monday to agree on a resolution for a ceasefire on the months-long Israel-Hamas war because of U.S. opposition. At the 2 hours of closed-door meetings, the U.S. called for humanitarian pauses. Many other council members were demanding a humanitarian ceasefire to deliver desperately needed aid and prevent more civilian deaths. Here's China and France's representatives to the United Nations Security Council, Zhang Jun and Nicolas de Riviere.
We call for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. This is desperately needed to enable full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access.
Given the gravity of the humanitarian situation and the scale of the needs of the Gaza population, France calls for an immediate humanitarian truce. This truce must be durable and sustained. It is absolutely necessary and must lead to a ceasefire.
China, which holds the Security Council presidency this month, said it will focus on efforts towards a ceasefire in Gaza. In the U.S., former President Donald Trump took the stand Monday in a New York Manhattan courtroom to defend his wealth and businesses, arguing with the judge overseeing his civil fraud trial and denouncing the case as a political witch hunt. The lawsuit accuses Trump of dramatically inflating his net worth. Edwin Vieira reports.
New York Attorney General Letitia James says the case against former President Donald Trump in his civil trial stands in spite of the outrage he voiced in his testimony. While on the stand, the former president attacked James and court officials as Democrats and biased Trump haters, but James says none of that refutes the evidence.
The only thing that matters are the facts and the numbers. And numbers, my friends, don't lie.
Judge Arthur Engoron has already ruled against the Trump Organization in a summary judgment. He found the former president and his family routinely defrauded banks and insurers by exaggerating his net worth. Trump is lashing back against the ruling with typical rage.
This is a case that should have never been brought. It's a case that should be dismissed immediately. The fraud was on behalf of the court. The court was the fraudster in this case.
Though those charges don't carry prison time, they could serve as a death sentence for Trump's businesses. Still, he has massive support in the GOP primary, and a New York Times poll even found he's slightly ahead of President Joe Biden in 6 battleground states. I'm Edwin J. Vieira for Pacifica Network and Public News Service.
Polls have begun to open in a few states for off-year elections that could give hints of voter sentiment ahead of next year's presidential contest. In Kentucky, Democratic Governor Andy Beshear is hoping that his support of abortion rights will persuade voters in his Republican-leaning state to look past their skepticism of the National Party and give him another term in office. Voters in Ohio will decide whether to pass a constitutional amendment guaranteeing an individual right to abortion. In Virginia, state legislative elections will determine whether Republicans control full state government or whether Democrats can continue serving as a bulwark against Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin's agenda. In New York, an exonerated member of the Central Park Five is poised to win a seat on the city council. The Supreme Court is considering a challenge to a federal law that prohibits people from having guns if they're under a domestic violence gun restraining order today. That's a court order to stay away from a spouse, partner or other family member. The federal appeals court in New Orleans struck down that law following the Supreme Court's Bruin decision in 2022 that expanded gun rights and also changed the way courts are supposed to evaluate restrictions on firearms. Monday, California Attorney General Rob Bonta released figures he says shows California's domestic gun violence restraining orders work and blasted the lawsuit filed by a Texas man.
I can't fathom how this is something we are debating. Of course, folks who have demonstrated a tendency to violence, who've been violent in the past, should not own guns. It's common sense. But that's not what this is about. This is really about the gun lobby trying to protect what it holds so sacred, never-ending profits.
California recorded a 63% reduction in per capita rates of domestic violence-related calls for law enforcement assistance involving a firearm between the years 1993 to 2019. I'm Christina Onnested, reporting for Pacifica Radio.